They called it dangerous. They said it should never be used again. Yet this soil trick from the 1800s quietly outgrew every compost pile modern gardeners could make. The vegetables were enormous, the colors deeper, the flavors almost sweet. For decades it was forgotten, until now. If you care about real soil health and you love uncovering the kind of wisdom our grandparents swore by, stay with me. Click that subscribe button because what you're about to hear might completely change how you feed your garden. Let's begin. I first learned about this strange soil formula from my grandfather. He was an old-fashioned gardener from Maine. Steady hands, slow voice, the kind of man who believed patience was a tool. He never bought fertilizers, he made his own. His garden was the talk of the neighborhood. Tomatoes as big as softballs, cabbage heads so heavy you could barely lift them. I once asked him what his secret was. He smiled and said, "It's something the big farms used before they figured out how to sell us bags of chemicals." Years later, while browsing through a second-hand shop in Vermont, I found an 1889 gardening journal. The pages were yellow, the ink faded, but right there in the center was a recipe for soil enrichment almost identical to what my grandfather had described. At the bottom, someone had written in shaky pencil, "Discontinued, too powerful for public use." I remember reading that line again and again. Too powerful? For plants? The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Somewhere along the line, gardening stopped being about understanding the soil and started being about buying solutions. Compost became cleaner, faster, more convenient, but maybe less alive. Older gardeners, especially those of you watching now, remember what healthy soil smelled like? Deep, earthy, a little wild, the kind that stayed damp even in summer heat and made everything grow thicker and greener. That old recipe hinted at something we've lost, a kind of slow-living chemistry that fed the ground from within. The truth is, people back then treated soil like a living creature. They fermented it, rested it, and stirred it until it almost breathed. So that's what this story is about. Not nostalgia for the past, but rediscovery. I want to know why that method worked so well, why it frightened a few officials, and why, even after being buried for more than a century, it still produces results that no store-bought compost can match. Before we travel back to the 1800s, I'd love to hear from you. Do you still use any old-time garden tricks like soaking banana peels or feeding plants with crushed eggshells? Share them in the comments. They might even connect to what we uncover later in this video. In the next part, we're going to the roots of this mystery, the forgotten century when gardeners used natural chemistry to grow food that stunned entire villages. Stay close, because what comes next explains why this soil trick was banned and why it might be the very secret your garden's been missing. Back in the 1800s, farmers didn't talk about nutrients or microbes, they talked about life. To them, soil was a living thing, something you fed, not something you fixed. Most of what they used came from their own animals, their own kitchens, their own patience. Nothing went to waste. And hidden among those traditions was a process so effective, so wildly productive, it became the secret weapon of a handful of farmers who refused to tell anyone else what they were doing. The story first appeared in letters between two gardeners in Yorkshire around 1854. One claimed he had found a way to awaken the earth using only what he had on hand. His plants grew twice as fast, he said, and even the clay soil, once considered hopeless, turned dark and crumbly after one season. His neighbors were suspicious. A few tried to copy him, but their soil soured instead. Whatever he was doing, he kept it close to his chest. By the time the method reached America, whispers had already begun. Some said it was unhygienic. Others said it smelled so strong it couldn't possibly be safe. That's when the newspapers started calling it the Black Brew. But here's what no one realized at the time. That brew was simply early microbial composting, fermented soil tea long before we had words like aerobic bacteria or enzyme activation. In other words, it was centuries ahead of its time. People didn't understand it, and that fear of what they didn't understand eventually got it banned. Local councils in some towns wrote ordinances against backyard soil fermentation. The official reason? Offensive odor and unregulated bacterial activity. What they didn't know is that those bacteria were doing exactly what modern science now says soil needs to thrive. And that's where the irony begins. The very method we outlawed for being too alive might be the one that could heal exhausted soil today. If that doesn't make you curious, it should. Because when I first recreated the recipe, the change I saw in my garden left me speechless. And soon you'll see why. Before we move on, if you've ever felt frustrated watching your compost take forever, or your plants struggling despite your care, this is where things start to make sense. You're about to see what the old gardeners knew instinctively, something that modern products can't replicate. So if you haven't already, hit subscribe and stay close. The next few minutes might save you years of guesswork in your garden. The banned trick was, at its heart, a living mixture, part compost, part ferment, part art. Farmers would dig a shallow pit, fill it with layers of straw, manure, bone ash, and vegetable scraps, then pour over a mix of rainwater, wood ash, and a small amount of sour milk or beer yeast. They'd cover it loosely with burlap or old hay and leave it for a month, letting nature do the work. During that time, the pile would warm itself, foam slightly, and release a sharp, earthy smell that some people found unbearable. But underneath, life was exploding. Billions of microorganisms woke up, feeding on the sugars and minerals, multiplying, transforming waste into a dense, living medium richer than anything you could buy. When farmers finally used it, they didn't spread it like compost, they soaked it into the ground, letting it flow deep into the roots. The results were absurd. Carrots grew thick and straight, beans doubled their pods, and even dry fields stayed moist longer. Science now explains what they didn't know. Fermentation broke organic material into amino acids and trace minerals faster than ordinary decomposition. It didn't just feed the soil, it electrified it. So why was it banned? Because the smell carried for miles, because it looked primitive, because industrial fertilizer companies were rising, and nobody wanted to compete with something you could make for free. Let that sink in. A natural, free, renewable soil tonic, pushed aside for convenience and profit. And here's my challenge to you. Don't just listen to this story, try it. Start with a small patch of garden and see what happens. If you believe in bringing life back to your soil the natural way, go ahead and subscribe, not for me, but for your own curiosity, because the next part of this story shows exactly how I recreated the banned soil trick using simple, safe materials, and how my garden responded in ways I never thought possible. When I decided to bring this 19th century trick back to life, I'll admit I was skeptical. I'd read the records, seen the results in yellowed photographs, but nothing prepares you for what happens when history meets your own backyard. I started small, one raised bed, and promised myself I'd document every step. I layered straw, vegetable scraps, and a little manure at the bottom. Then I added crushed bone meal for calcium and a sprinkle of wood ash for potassium. Finally, came the catalyst, a fermented mix of old beer, sour milk, and rainwater that had been sitting for 3 days in a wooden barrel. The moment I poured it in, the pile came alive. Soft bubbling, faint heat, the unmistakable scent of something powerful waking up. Within days, the mixture had transformed. It no longer smelled foul. It smelled fertile, like a forest floor after rain. When I stirred it, the texture was unlike any compost I'd ever seen. Dark, almost oily, dense with invisible life. I soaked it into the bed and waited. By week 2, seedlings that normally took 10 days had already doubled in height. The leaves were a shade deeper, the stems stronger. By week 4, I knew I was looking at something extraordinary. My control bed, same plants, same sunlight, same watering schedule, looked healthy, but the banned soil bed looked alive. The roots ran thicker, the moisture held longer, and even pests seemed to avoid it. It wasn't just growth, it was resilience. Plants that usually wilted in summer heat stayed upright through entire afternoons. The flavor of the produce, especially the tomatoes, was richer, almost sweet. It was like watching the earth remember how to feed itself again. That's when I understood what those old gardeners had discovered. They weren't forcing growth, they were restoring balance. They had found a way to amplify the natural cycle of decay and renewal until the soil became self-sustaining. And maybe that's the real lesson here. We keep trying to fix nature when all she ever needed was patience and understanding. If this part of the story moved you, if it makes you think about how many natural secrets we've traded for convenience, then take a moment and subscribe. Because what we're doing here isn't just gardening, it's reclaiming knowledge that was almost lost, and I want you to be part of that revival. Now that you know how the method works, let's see what it means, because what happened next in my experiment changed how I think about modern compost forever. A month after I started, I compared both garden beds side by side. The difference was undeniable. The banned soil plants were taller by nearly a foot. Their leaves were thicker, darker, and glossier. The soil beneath them stayed damp even after days without watering. I dug up a handful. It was warm, soft, and teeming with earthworms. The control bed, fed with store-bought compost, was fine, but ordinary. I sent a few samples to a friend who's a soil biologist. When the results came back, the message was clear. Microbial activity in the banned soil was more than triple. That means every inch of earth was alive and working, breaking down nutrients, defending roots, and building structure faster than any bagged compost could. And that's when the truth hit me. The method we abandoned because of smell and superstition was scientifically perfect. It wasn't witchcraft, it was biology, centuries before biology had a name for it. So, why does this matter to you? Because every garden tells a story. If you're older, you've seen how the land changes, how the soil gets thinner, how fertilizers promise miracles but deliver maintenance. This trick reminds us that the best growth doesn't come from control. It comes from collaboration with the living world under our feet. It's not about nostalgia. It's about respect for time, for patience, for the rhythm of the earth that our ancestors trusted. If you're listening right now and you've ever felt discouraged by failed compost piles or lifeless soil, take heart. The answers aren't lost, they're just waiting to be remembered. And if you believe, as I do, that old wisdom still has a place in modern gardens, then join me. Subscribe, not just for more videos, but to be part of a community that values the kind of gardening that feeds both the soil and the soul. Share this with a friend who still believes in doing things the natural way. Together, maybe we can bring a bit of that lost knowledge back where it belongs, right here, in the ground beneath our hands. Because this isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a return. The soil never forgets. It just waits for us to listen again.